Okay, so we left off at Khrushchev. So Khrushchev and the United States are going to be kind of embroiled in this Cuban Missile Crisis. So President John F. Kennedy, he surrounds the Cuban islands, and he basically says that no missiles will get into Cuba. We play chicken, and Khrushchev and the Soviet Union are going to back down, but it is called brinkmanship, and brinkmanship is basically just we are on the brink of declaring nuclear war, and we do this to get them to back down. We talked about the space race. The space race is going to happen in the 1960s because Sputnik is a space satellite that the Russians get off before the United States. So they get the first actual satellite into space, and that really causes a huge humiliation to the United States. So Sputnik, and when Kennedy hears this, President John F. Kennedy, he's going to go ahead and tell all Americans, please focus on math and science, and we are going to be the first ones to get to the moon. So it's the race, the space race. There's going to be a continued destruction or deterioration of the relationship between China and the Soviet Union. China doesn't really want anything to do with the Soviet Union because they have their own system led by Mao Zedong. So they don't care about what the Soviets want. So there's a different style of communism. Brezhnev is going to come in. He's going to come into power in 1964. And what you're going to start seeing is an easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, particularly after this Cuban Missile Crisis. And so we're going to start seeing people actually starting to want to talk before we jump to nuclear war or the possibility of nuclear war. So we see an easing of tension. And the easing of tension is this French word called détente. And détente just means easing of tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And it's going to be during President Nixon's time, and you're going to see it happening with Kennedy after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Gorbachev is going to come into power in 1985. And when he comes into power, he's coming in to kind of the dead end of the Soviet Union. It's already starting to really collapse, and it's collapsing because of financing. The Soviet Union tried to invade Afghanistan, and the United States is going to assist the Afghans with overthrowing, with stopping the Soviets from actually invading. And so Gorbachev, when he does come into power, he's kind of coming in to a country who is financially ruined. There's no money, and so the Soviet Union is starting to kind of fall apart and collapse. He is going to try and initiate some reforms, so he is going to try and do some reforms, but it's not really going to work. So in these reforms, Glasnost is the openness, and it's the ending of censorship and criticism of government's going to be allowed. So in this, he's going to allow like freedom of the press. Pereskovia is going to be an economic reform, so that he's going to also try and do some economic reform, and he's going to allow private ownership. And this is kind of a copy of Lenin's new economic policies that he did, the NEP. So you kind of see them going back to what Lenin had tried. It does kind of help, but it's just too late. So you'll see a revival of foreign investments in the Soviet economy. There's going to get an increase of production of consumer goods. There's widespread disagreement with Gorbachev's reforms. The move away from communism by the people who were such staunch communists like Stalin and Khrushchev. You kind of see the Soviet Union having a little bit of a problem with this moving away. There's going to be an increased independence for the Eastern Bloc, the satellite nations. So the nations that were being controlled or being influenced by the Soviet Union, you're going to start seeing them breaking away. Why you should know this: you could be asked specific questions about the rise of communism in Russia, so knowing the events that leads up to Vladimir Lenin's rise to power, things that are very specific about policies of the Soviet leaders, the events. You could do a comparison. So when you look at this question, Mikhail Gorbachev allowed all the following except. And so what you kind of need to figure out is what he allows and then which one he doesn't allow. So that would be your answer choice. So he allows the production of consumer goods. He's going to allow people to discuss the government policy. He does allow private land ownership, and he allows foreign investments. He does not make it a democratic government. So just kind of knowing the rulers, and Gorbachev's at the end of the actual Cold War, you're seeing the easing of tensions, the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So when we look at the Cold War is just a real tense time in history between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's a democracy versus communist kind of world. And so the US and the Soviet Union are the two superpowers left after World War II. And they had a common enemy in Germany. And so once the common enemy is destroyed in World War II, these two nations go after each other. Now, they never fight directly. The US and the Soviet Union, they never fight directly, but they fight through other things. So like when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, that's going to be a fight kind of where the US is going to aid Afghans to fight the Soviets. And one of those Afghans that will aid will be like the Taliban members and bin Laden. So we'll train people to fight the Soviets. When you look at the nature of consequences, so politically, this Iron Curtain, this phrase that's used by Winston Churchill, this is going to describe post-World War II Europe. And this curtain descends, and it's basically a division between Eastern and Western Europe. Eastern Europe is going to be communist, and Western Europe, or the Western half, is going to be democracies. And so you're going to see this tension between the two styles of governments. In 1946, Britain, France, the US are going to combine their zones. They had divided Germany into 4 zones, and it's going to make West Germany. And West, because it's in the western part, is a democracy. And remember, when you look at Britain and you look at the United States, you're looking at Western democracies. You're looking at democracies. The Soviet section, East Germany, is going to be a communist nation. And because of that, East Germany will typically be behind the times because the Soviets aren't going to be able to have a lot of money to actually assist in East Germany like Britain, France, and the United States will have to help the western half of Germany survive or recover after World War II. In 1947, the United States is going to create the Marshall Plan. And what the Marshall Plan is the U.S. will give loans, money, to any countries who are actually trying to recover from the war. So remember, after World War I, we don't do very much. The U.S. kind of goes into an isolationist period. We're going into a neutral period. But in 1947, the United States decides that the reason why Hitler and Mussolini come into power is because the economies of those countries were awful after World War I. And so what we decided is after World War II, we're going to rebuild the economies of Europe. So we do this with the understanding that these countries will not go towards totalitarian governments. They're not going to go towards fascist or communist governments if you help them. And this is going to reflect the U.S. policy of containment. And containment just means we're trying to stop the spreading of communism. Think of it as like the quarantine speech by FDR, where we're going to isolate this disease of communism. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine is going to get issued by President Harry S. Truman. And what the U.S. promises is we're going to help Greece and Turkey fight communism. So the U.S. will give aid to Greece and Turkey to help them stop a communist takeover. And again, this is a containment policy. 1947 to 1948, Stalin is really upset because of the whole fact of West Berlin is getting all the really skilled laborers. So he is going to decide to block all of Berlin. So he does a blockade of Berlin. The Berlin blockade is going to make the United States go ahead and send in supplies to the people of Berlin. So we do the Berlin airlift. So the U.S. every single day, we send in supplies like food, medical supplies to the people of Berlin. And the Berlin blockade is basically not effective because Stalin thinks he's going to make the people love him. He's going to, choke him to death until they love him. So it's an abusive relationship. When he does this and we go ahead and we send in all these supplies, the people of Berlin love the United States and not him. And so he'll eventually lift the blockade. And the West, the United States, really wins this like first kind of like incident in the Cold War. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this is an alliance between the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe. This is what I like to call a democracy-only club. So only democracies are allowed in NATO. NATO still exists today. It's a militaristic alliance. And so if you attack one, you attack all. So it's an involvement foreign policy. In 1950 to 1953, the United States is going to get involved in the Korean War. The Korean War is basically a civil war between the northern and the southern half of Korea. Because when the Soviet Union is going to help us out in Japan, they go down into the northern part of Korea and they can, pass out a lot of pamphlets about how communism is great and it's a really poor area. And so North Korea becomes a communist nation, and the South Korea area becomes a democracy because that's where the U.S. is actually freeing them from the Japanese control during World War II. The UN is going to ask the United States and the coalition forces to stop North Korea, which is now a communist nation and is backed by the Soviet Union and China. They're going to ask the coalition forces to stop North Korea from invading South Korea. During this war, really, no one wins, no one loses. North Korea is going to be pushed back to the 38th parallel, and that's just the lines on the map. And North Korea will remain a communist nation, and South Korea will remain a democracy. So you return things to the status quo, the way things were before the Korean War actually broke out. An armistice ends the Korean War. This is a UN military action. It's not an actual war that the U.S. is involved in. It's a war, but it's a UN action. It's a police action that they take. So it's about keeping peace. All right, so then you look at 1954, the Geneva Conference is going to be set up. And in the Geneva Conference, the United Nations is going to go ahead and decide that France is going to go ahead and allow North Vietnam to stay a communist nation under Ho Chi Minh, and then South Vietnam is going to be a democracy led by Diem, and he is kind of a corrupt U.S.-backed leader. So because he's corrupt and he is backed by the U.S., that's not going to look good for us. And Ho Chi Minh is taking North Vietnam, and he's made it a communist nation. And so what you're going to see with the Vietnam War is it's a war, it's a civil war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. After World War II, one of the big trends is to divide nations. So we divided Korea, and the North became a communist nation, and the South became a democracy. We do the same thing with the Geneva Conference, or the Geneva Accords, in which North Vietnam becomes a communist nation led by Minh, and then the South Vietnamese area is going to be led by Diem, and it's going to be a democracy that's backed by the U.S. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact is going to be created, and this is an alliance system between the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. This is a communist-only group. So it's an alliance system too, and it's a military alliance. So an attack on the Soviet Union means you will have all the Eastern Bloc, the satellite countries, also fighting you. In 1961, you have the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which the U.S. tries to expel. They try and kill Fidel Castro, who's the communist leader of Cuba. It fails. The Cuban exiles don't actually get to take back Cuba, and now Castro is upset, and he goes ahead and he asks the Soviet Union for help, and that's how you get the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And in 1962, America discovers that Soviet missiles are in Cuba. We play chicken, and the Soviets back down. Late 1960s, the Vietnam War ensues. It's thousands of U.S. troops are going to fight in Vietnam, and they're fighting to keep South Vietnam from becoming a communist nation. 1972, SALT 1 is going to be signed. SALT 1 and SALT 2 are strategic arms limitation talks. And basically, the US and the Soviet Union are going to start this policy of détente, which is the easing of tensions between the US and the Soviet country. The US is going to start to leave Vietnam in 1973. We call it Vietnamization, where we're gradually removing soldiers away, getting them out of Vietnam. Once we do that, Vietnam falls to communism.